Now that we've talked about the server-side components in the reactive quote services app case study, it's time to start turning our attention to the client side. So we're going to start by talking about the classes that make the client structure and functionality and that use the Spring 6 HTTP interface mechanisms to send and receive HTTP GET and POST requests and responses to and from the QuoteServices microservices. So let's start by taking a look at the QuoteClient class. This class performs asynchronous remote method invocations on the API gateway microservice for the purpose of obtaining the Handey and Zippy quotes. And you can see here that we have the class, which you can get at the link down below, and we annotate this class with the @component annotation, which instructs Spring to enable auto detection and wiring of dependent implementation classes using class path scanning. Now you might wonder, what is it that we're trying to auto wire? Well, we're trying to auto wire proxies that are automatically generated using this new Spring 6 HTTP interface mechanism. And we've got two of them. One is called the Handey QuoteAPI, which, no surprise, talks to the Handey quote microservice. And the other is the Zippy QuoteAPI, which, no surprise, talks to the Zippy quote microservice. And both of these things get auto-wired, so we don't have to deal with defining the constructors explicitly. Now, we define a bunch of thin proxy methods that will return fluxes of quotes based on various things. There's post quotes, there's one that is used to search, there's another one that uses to search for all the queries that match, one that's used to search for any of the queries that match, and so on and so forth. And all of these little methods return fluxes of quotes. This particular one returns a flux of quotes based on the quote IDs parameter, and it will go to the designated microservice, which is given by the so-called route name. Now, it turns out, because of a limitation, which is kind of annoying, with Spring 6 HTTP interface, there's no way to do dynamic path updates with HTTP interface. So we have to manually write a separate wrapper proxy, if you will, that takes the route name and then either calls the Handey quote API post quotes method or calls the Zippy quote API post quotes method. In contrast, Retrofit supports dynamic path updating. That's one of the few areas where Retrofit actually does a better job than HTTP interface does. So let's now go ahead and take a look at the QuoteAPI interface. So we have a couple of different implementations here. One's for the Zippy Quote API, one's for the Handey Quote API. So we'll take a look at the Zippy Quote one first in a bit more detail. So this uses the so-called Spring 6 HTTP interface to abstract away the details of making async remote method invocations using HTTP. And here's what we do. We have these proxy methods that we write: get all quotes, post quotes, search, searchex, and so on. And you can see that they very closely mimic the signature of the controller methods. So you'll see here that we've got post quotes looks pretty much like what post quotes looks like. In particular, all these methods can return project reactor flux types, which is something that you cannot do with Retrofit. So Retrofit is limited in that respect. And they also use the same annotations as the Spring controller annotation. So that's also a nice commonality between HTTP interface and what's going on with Spring controller, whereas Retrofit did not do that. There's a similar interface that's used to define the Handey Quote API. Something else I should mention, up here at the top, you see where it says HTTP Exchange. That's where we have to hard code the use of the Zippy prefix. So this says it's going to Zippy. That was something that you could have done in a more dynamic way without having to hard code it by using Retrofit. So here's the Handey Quote API. You can see we just change Zippy Quote to Handey Quote, and away we go. So the final thing I want to show you is the structure and functionality of the client beans class. So as usual, you can mark things with the bean annotation to indicate these are factory methods. And in this case, we have the get Zippy Quote API factory method that will make a corresponding Zippy Quote API instance. And it does this in kind of two steps. There's also a similar factory method for Handey Quote API, but this works in basically two steps. We first create a new web client that's going to connect to the gateway at the gateway URL. And then we go ahead and we make ourselves a new instance of the Zippy Quote API via the HTTP service proxy factory, which we connect via an adapter to the web client. So we connect those things together, and then we create ourselves an instance of the Zippy QuoteAPI class, and that's what gets returned back. That's what gets auto-wired into the QuoteClient proxy class that we had to write because there's no support for dynamic path updates in HTTP interface, which is very annoying. So that's the overview of the structure and functionality of the client classes. Next, we're going to go and walk through the implementation of all the code on the client side.